This this talk, and I'm glad to see Mike Kearsley here on the call, because I missed his questions last night. But the question, the whole, in publishing a set of lectures, it really was my purpose to indicate that Masonic research is not just about the history of Freemasonry as a thing. It could be the history of a particular lodge, or research about a particular Freemason, or research about particular Masonic principles that we might like to follow through. So I think Masonic research, people think, oh, well, you know, we don't have access to the Regius Poem, so we don't have ancient history, we don't have records or minutes of lodges going back to 1600s. You know, what's the point of Masonic research? Well, I think there's a lot of Masonic research that people simply overlook. They just haven't thought about researching a particular interest that they have. So that's really the purpose, I suppose, of publishing a book of these diverse papers. There's something there, I think, for everybody. But tonight's talk is one that's particularly close to my heart, because I am interested in Masonic history. And as I've said to Mike Kearsley more than once, I like to set up a straw man and then knock him down. Very easy to do. If he fights back, it's a bit of a problem. So I'm sure you're all sort of familiar with this idea that once upon a time, the medieval Masons moved across the European countryside from the site of one great cathedral or castle being built to some other place where another cathedral or castle was being built, and taking their skills with them. Because they were illiterate, they needed particular signs and words so that the Masons at the destination, wherever they're travelling to, would recognise them and as having the necessary skills. They worked, ate, slept, played in the lodge set up for them on the south side of the building, obviously to catch the sun in the northern hemisphere. And they might take as apprentices into the lodge their sons or young men or boys in the locality to be instructed in the trade. It is said, generally speaking, that there's unlikely to have been anything of a symbolical or speculative kind, as we would understand that, in their teachings or work at the time. I quote Jones in the paper quite a bit, but one quote I think it's worth emphasising here is, he says, "We seem to miss some evidence that would more amply and definitely link up the old charges with our ritual." Now, that's probably true, but my view is that this appealing sort of rustic and idealised scene of the travelling Masons going from one cathedral to another doesn't really stand up to too much inspection. And so it's my purpose to knock down that straw man tonight. The question is, were they travelling Masons? Now, some eminent Masonic writers, you've probably read, Gould, Macaulay, and others, support this sort of view. I think that it's likely to have been more an exception than the rule. Jones says there's no reference to the tradition of the travelling Masons in literature earlier than the 17th century. At one of the great Gothic cathedrals, Masons, in my view, could be employed over many generations in the one place. Reims was begun about 1211. And although the west facade was finished about 1255, thank you. Look, I love Brendan's overheads. The PowerPoint's just marvellous. Marvellous, Brendan. You've excelled yourself. The west facade was finished about 1255, but Construction of the towers dragged on until the 15th century. After a fire in 1194, a new building was begun at Chartres. The vaulting of the choir was completed by 1220, but the cathedral was not consecrated till 1260. Work on the flying buttresses was still going on in the first part of the 14th century. Beauvais, that you see here, was commenced in 1225. Although the choir was completed in 1272, various collapses of the vaulting meant it had to be reconstructed and strengthened, and that work dragged on till the end of the 14th century. And further, the building was extended westward after the 100 Years' War, so the south and north transepts and crossing date from 1500. With work going on for such a long time at one place, it seems unlikely to me that the masons engaged would need to move around looking for work from place to place. Even smaller jobs might take a long time. We know that at the Vale Royal Abbey, building operations continued for 50 years. Carnarvon Castle took 38 years to complete. Building at Eton College ceased for the time being in 1460, but the work had already been in progress for 19 years. It seems unlikely to me that masons engaged on this sort of work would need to move around looking for work very much. There is an idea that groups of masons were permitted to travel across Europe under a protection of the papal bull or license. There doesn't seem to be much evidence of this. There's a discussion in Jones and Newpin Jones at some length. There's also discussion of the Commissine Masters of Italy or the French compagnonnage. But that seems to me to be likely to just be groups of masons working together on a particular site. And as far as the French compagnonnage is concerned, the term simply means those who eat bread together, from which, of course, we get the English word companion. I quote Botham saying that the origins of the compagnonnage is known, at least in the 16th century, and there are legends like Freemasonry going back to the pre-Christian era, but as in the case with craft masonry, these legends don't seem to have much by way of foundation. There's no evidence apparently of the existence of the compagnonnage or a similar organisation in the 15th century, let alone any earlier than that. It seems to be true that masons might migrate to work on a particular site, either because there was no work in their home district or because they were impressed. And this is something I hadn't thought about very much, but the king or the church could order the impressment of masons to do their work. Jones gives quite a few interesting examples, and the paper, I deal with a few of them. In 1360, 13 sheriffs were ordered by the Crown to send 568 masons to Windsor. In 1361, 17 sheriffs were ordered to send 1,360 masons. Many more were wanted in following years. In 1370, Master Henry de Yverley and Master William de Winford were each ordered by the Crown to take 50 hewers of stone, the one in London and nearby counties, and the other in Somerset, Dorset, and so on, and bring them to Orwell. In 1377, Henry de Yverley was also appointed to take masons wherever found for work on the Palace of Westminster and the Tower of London, with power to imprison the disobedient. But he was not permitted to take masons in the fee of the church. It's been suggested by some that where a large project, like a cathedral, was concerned, the supply of local masons would have to be supplemented by outsiders. For example, I'm quoting Newpin Jones again, of the 131 masons employed at the building of the Cistercian Abbey of Vale Royal in Cheshire, during the 3 years that they were looking at in the documents, 1278 to 1280, they estimated only 5%, or maybe most 10% were local. And interestingly enough, at some place like Carnarvon Castle, in the early 14th century, only the same sort of percentage were of Welsh origins. So the masons must have come from somewhere else. So therefore, it seems to me that the medieval stonemason might well travel some distance to find work. But once he was there, unless he was impressed by the king's authority, he might remain on site to see his son or even his grandson continue the work. The second question I wanted to deal with was the issue of whether they were free, whether they were free masons. 2 words, free masons. There's evidence that masons were impressed to work on major projects, and to that extent they were not free. And that raises a further issue that I must have affected many masons. Most craftsmen or artisans would have been tied to a lord or under the feudal system, especially if the mason was being trained in a quarry owned by the lord. It must be remembered that the great prelates and monasteries were just as important feudal masters as the king and the nobles. And this would have restricted a craftsman's ability to travel. He would have been prevented from leaving his lord's lands without permission. With the rise of towns, however, craftsmen, once resident there, could have greater personal liberty. Eventually, of course, and this is, I think, Ian Taylor's area of expertise. I'm not sure that Ian's with us tonight, but he was certainly around last night. With the rise of towns, of course, the craft guild system arose, and this gave or could give the craftsmen the status of burghers, an independent status in keeping with the growing political and economic power of the towns and cities, which were getting royal charters. It is sometimes, you'll see it sometimes argued that the master builders, by which I suppose we mean the architects or designers of the Gothic cathedrals and the large feudal castles, were clerics and were therefore bound to and under the authority of the church, again, without freedom of action. On that sort of argument, the masons were only craftsmen undertaking the work designed by others. Now, there are no doubt clerics who built what they themselves designed. A famous example, of course, is St. Francis of Assisi, who's supposed to have rebuilt the church of San Damiano with his own hands, but I suspect the story's apocryphal. However, we do know a good example is Abbot Suger, who was Abbot of Cluny from 1122 and Regent of France from 1147. He certainly designed the Abbey Church at Saint-Denis, which of course became the site for the French monarchy's coronations and funerals. We know that before 1140, he built the new twin-towered west front, and by 1144, he had added a new choir. Lord Clark gives an excellent example of this, and really Abbot Suger was responsible for the new French Gothic style at that time. Lord Clark, in his series Civilization, I don't know if you've read the book or watched the TV series, but he tells an interesting episode about the abbot's carpenters who told him that they couldn't obtain timber of the size he required because trees just didn't grow that tall. But the good abbot took him out into the forest and he found a dozen trees answering to the requirements and got the carpenters to fell them. So Abbot Suger certainly was hands-on, and we have records of his reports of the building's measurements. The fact that he doesn't mention the name of a master builder, however, doesn't mean that there wasn't one. And the fact is that we do know the names of quite a few master masons who were in charge of the works. We know their names. Giselbertus at the Abbey of Vézelay, of Henry of Reims at Westminster Abbey, John of Gloucester, Westminster. No doubt the ecclesiastical patrons took the credit. And an example that Jones gives is Bishop William of Wickham, who was Chancellor of Edward III and Richard II, claimed to have built parts of Windsor Castle, the cathedral and college at Winchester, and to have founded New College, Oxford. But there doesn't seem any reason to me that the expert master craftsmen, whose names we sometimes know, were responsible not just for the construction, but also for the design of the building and the solution of the complex architectural problems which would be encountered. At Canterbury Cathedral, for example, which was begun in 1174, we know that William of Sens, and Sens was a place where the cathedral had started in 1140, we know that William of Sens produced the design. His successor was William the Englishman, who completed the choir in 1184. There's an interesting sideline that Professor Bonney reports in his book that William of Sens had to give up the work because he fell from a scaffolding and he was seriously injured. So William the Englishman took over. So it seems to me that the master masons during this medieval period had at least some freedom, barring impressment on the king's authority, and that, with notable exceptions, they were independent agents, not in clerical orders under church authority. The third question I wanted to raise is, how did they live? Newp and Jones note that the names of many 13th and 14th century masons were place names of areas where stone was quarried. So it seems likely that masons trained up in or were recruited from quarrying areas. Now, the trainee mason might graduate from quarrying to preparing the stone and eventually to laying or fine carving. There's a lot of evidence of masons working in the quarries and of lodges being established there. Obviously, there was preparation in the quarry to save the transportation of costs of unworked stone. And it seems reasonable that in the workshops or lodges attached to abbeys or cathedrals, that the experience and training was gained, which turned the rough stoneworkers into...
And that very much sums up how Barcelona feel about themselves.
Sorry, I'm getting somebody talking to me. Is that a question or a comment or?
Identity, it's about culture, it's about a sense of belonging. That's very much how the club perceives itself, not just...
Brother Robert Pearson and others, are we able to all mute, please? Just so we can allow the presenter. Thank you. Don and Gary as well, please.
I'm happy to take questions, but
of course.
I just couldn't hear the question.
I think that was the telly in the background.
Oh, okay. That's
Yeah.
all right. Good. Yeah, so how did they live? Yeah. Obviously, you wouldn't want to transport unworked stone from the quarry to any great distance. So having worked the stone to a certain extent, you'd bring it to the site where it would be reworked or carved or whatever. Of course, the early records show us that the erection of a lodge was the very first thing that was done at a building site like this. There's plenty of references to masons' lodges. In 1320, a man was paid to clean out the lodge at St. Stephen's Chapel, Westminster. In 1321, 2 shillings and sixpence was paid for straw to cover the lodge at Carnarvon Castle. In 1325, the workmen at York Cathedral were to take their meals within their lodge. One wonders where they were taking their meals otherwise. In 1369 to 1371, there was provided a lodge for masons at the building of Windsor Castle. We know they earned wages. Newpin-Jones, in an absolutely heroic study, went through enormous amounts of wage records dating from the late 14th century. And there is plenty of examples of learners or inexperienced stone workers getting higher wages as they got more experience and the quality of the work probably improved. There's a contract they found of 1359 between the Dean and Chapter of Hereford Cathedral and John of Evesham, which included a condition that he was to instruct the labourers under him in the arts of masonry and carpentry. Wages were generally stated as a weekly rate, but some masons seem to have been hired by the year, and some were even retained for life. At the Cistercian Abbey of Cooper Angus in 1485, John the mason was hired for 5 years. In 1492, Thomas Mowbray, mason, was hired for 5 years, and when his contract came up in 1497, he was hired for the rest of his life. It's unlikely, in my view, however, that such appointments applied to anyone other than the master masons in the highest ranks of the craft. It's interesting in the records that there are several terms used for mason which seem to indicate a hierarchical structure to the craft. At the top, the hewers or cutters, then the setters or layers, and then the hammerers or scapulars, who seem to work mostly in the quarries. But above them all was the freestone masons. And the difference in these ranks can be seen by the different pay rates that applied. The inference is that they were promoted over time from the lower to the higher grades. There is interesting evidence that some diversified their interests. Some took agricultural property, some hired out horses and carts, and bought and sold stone. So that's pretty logical. And that was probably important because it seems from the evidence that during the winter months, work on the building sites mostly ceased. Interestingly, the hours of labour differed over the year. We can see this in the difference between summer and winter rates of pay. The London regulations of 1275 and 1296 fixed the mason's daily wage without food at 5p in summer, 3p in winter, and 4p in spring and autumn. From the Vale Royal Abbey building accounts in the late 13th century, there are notes stating at the start of November, and I quote, "Here the payments are decreased on account of the short days." And at the beginning of February, it says, "Here the payments are increased on account of the longer days." The Masons' Ordinance of 1370 fixed the winter hours as from daylight until dark, with 1 hour for dinner and 15 minutes for drinking in the afternoon. Which reminds me, I'm getting thirsty. The summer hours were from sunrise to 30 minutes before sunset, with 1 hour for dinner, 30 minutes for sleeping, and 30 minutes for drinking. Newpin-Jones actually, while I'm dealing with how they lived, Newpin-Jones actually made a consideration of the sort of health problems stonemasons might have suffered. Grit and stone dust in the daily work would have affected their lungs. And although I don't think there's a lot of evidence about the effect of silicosis on the workforce. Generally speaking, I suppose in medieval times, people lived comparatively short lives in any event. John of Evesham's contract provided that if illness prevented him from working for 1 or 2 weeks, he would still get his full pay. But if the absence was longer, he got only 12p a week, instead of the 3 shillings he was getting as the master mason. And there are other examples of these sorts of arrangements, which effectively amounts to some sort of pension if the master mason became disabled or infirm. The next question I'm asking is, were they organised as a craft? This is really Ian Taylor's area of expertise, but although the guild regulations for more than 40 trades are prescribed in the York Memorandum Book, none relate to masons. And the same is true at Norwich, Leicester, Bristol, Coventry and Nottingham, wherever the published records can be located. Although the London municipal regulations regarding masons date from 1356, and they deal with wages and so on, there's no evidence of guild organisation until 1376, when 4 masons were elected to the Common Council to represent the mystery. There also is not much evidence in this time for formal apprenticeships. And I quote, according to the usage of the city, or 7 years as we understood it. As an apprenticeship was an avenue of membership to a guild, and then the freedom of a borough, it seems that at the time that we're talking about, there's probably not much ability for masons to have got the city, the freedom of the particular place. And it wasn't till quite late. So the Statute of Artificers in 1563, that we find references to the wages of a mason's apprentice. The next thing I wanted to cover is, and this is the thing that really excites a lot of Masonic authors. What did they believe? What did they believe? Can we understand, or can we extrapolate anything of what they actually believed about their craft? I'm quite Lord Clark in the paper that, looking at the cathedral at Chartres, for example, the idea that the structure was based on a very complex scheme of geometry seemed to him very hard to credit. He does refer to the idea that medieval men would consider geometry a divine activity. We've seen that wonderful picture of God as the divine geometer, and this concept may have inspired the architects, but Chartres, we know, was the centre of a school of philosophy devoted to Plato, and in particular, the study of Plato's Timaeus. Now that sets out Plato's theories of geometry and what became known as Platonic solids. The whole universe interpreted in the form of measurable harmony. And I refer in the paper to Professor Ball's account of the cathedral school at Chartres and the reference he makes to Thierry of Chartres, who became Chancellor of the school in 1142. Ball also quotes Otto von Simpson, and I think it's worth quoting again. The first Gothic, in the aesthetic, technical and symbolic aspects of its design, is intimately connected with the metaphysics of measure and number and weight. It seeks to embody the vision that the Platonists of Chartres had first unfolded, no longer content with the mere image of truth, but insisting upon the realisation of its laws. Seen in this light, the creation of Gothic marks and reflects an epoch in the history of Christian thought, the change from the mystical to the rational approach to truth, the dawn of Christian metaphysics. perhaps a little bit strong, that quotation, but it seems to me impossible for us now to actually prove that the masons working on the Gothic cathedrals had that sort of intellectualized approach to the work. If the Regius manuscript is any guide to what they believed, there was a belief or story that masonry was of great age. King Solomon's temple did not figure prominently, however. The art of geometry as taught by Euclid was absolutely essential. King Athelstan gets an honourable mention as somehow bringing masonry to England and giving some of the rules which, at least allegedly at that time, currently in 1390 or whenever it was written, the idea of an annual assembly of the whole craft and so on. There's a lot of time spent in the Regius manuscript on behaviour in church and at the festive board, but no King Solomon's temple, although Noah's flood and the Tower of Babylon are referred to, as well as the 4 crowned martyrs who are taken to be masons. Hook manuscript, which is usually dated to 1410 or thereabouts, early 15th century, also makes much of the science of geometry, and Pythagoras is praised, etc. The Tower of Babel gets a mention, but it's Abraham, not Noah, that figures in transmitting the knowledge of masonry. So what does this mean? First, it seems to me that the masons at that time believed the craft was very old, though whether they actually believed the truth of the stories they told about it, it's another story. But perhaps the stories were really considered to be, as we would say, allegories. But secondly, geometry was key to the science. Thirdly, masons considered themselves to be an honourable fraternity, which had been supported by kings in the old days. And lastly, membership of the fraternity, or the mystery, as they would say, required certain moral behaviours, as well as certain rules governing masonry as a craft. So, brethren, I hope that has been of some interest. I'll leave that there. Thank you, Brendan, for the wonderful PowerPoint projection.